Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ground Floor Podcast. My name is JC Stain, and I'm incredibly excited today to be talking to Mr. Joseph Haynes. Joseph, how are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. I'm really glad to be here, and I want to thank you for reaching out to me. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of your podcast, bro.
Of course, it's a privilege for me as well, because I feel like you've done so much things that are so important, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to discussing that with you. We'll get to that in a minute, but first,
Yeah,
I want to mention to everyone. Obviously, those people who've been listening to my podcast for a while or have been listening on YouTube, especially, will notice that this is the first ever podcast we have with video, which I'm really excited for. Usually we just have audio. So, Joseph, that means to those people who listen to me, you're the first one of my guests who they can see.
wow, history,
History
history.
indeed.
That feels kind of nice. I'm not gonna lie. That's cool. I would say too. I know we talked about this before we started recording. This is my first like video podcast too. But it definitely adds like a different vibe because you can see the other person, and I know specifically with COVID happening, and we can't necessarily meet in person and talk to people. When you can see the other person and you can like see their face and everything like that when you're talking about like just important stuff, it definitely adds more of that community kind of like I know where you're coming from, you know where I'm coming from vibe. So yeah, this is cool. I like this.
I'm glad. So, Joseph, just to the people who have never heard of you before and don't know who you are, I've never seen you, please tell the listeners who you are.
Oh man, that's such a funny question. Anytime somebody asks me that question, I'm always like, who am I? Because I feel like that concept is always evolving because I'm always trying to like change to become a better person. But I would say, I always say this in this order. I'm a human first, then I'm a family person, then I care about other people. I'm an actor, I'm a musician and an activist. But I would say, I'm just an everyday guy that looks at the world and want to make a difference in the world. I care about my community. I really grew up with a sense of wanting to see the area that I was living in be a better place. And so my parents they raised me and my five other brothers and sisters to love one another and then love other people. Doesn't matter what their background is, doesn't matter what their color is, whatever. We were just taught to really have that sense of care and dignity, and so I've kind of taken that with me into the world. I love music. I absolutely love music. Like I listen to all different types of music. It was funny the other day. I was driving with a friend, and I put on. We were listening to like this hip hop track, and the next day I put on Coldplay, and she turned and looked at me. She's like, "You listen to Coldplay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I like what I like," you know. But I grew up listening to like different groups, and so music is a huge part of my life as well. And then I used to live in New Orleans, and then I moved from New Orleans to Seattle after a few years, and then from Seattle, Chicago, and now I live in LA. And I wouldn't change that for the world. I love it out here. And hey, man, just trying to grow every day, specifically in the middle of this pandemic, and have good conversations with people like you, bro.
That's awesome, man. Thank you very much. So let's get right into the meat of it, because the reason
Yeah,
why the first time I heard of Joseph or saw Joseph was on a Jubilee video, which we'll talk about in a little later. But the so I saw you. Obviously, you were sort of, especially in the video that I watched, you made it right through to the very end. So there was a lot of time in the video for you to sort of develop a character and so on, and
yeah,
everyone could,
yeah,
it was really funny. So one thing that Jubilee does is they put your social media handle at the bottom.
yeah,
So I saw that. I went and by the time I saw the video, Black
yeah,
Lives Matter was already in full swing. It was
yeah,
so I then went, checked your Instagram profile, and your story was just riddled with Black Lives Matter content. And one of the things that I saw was that you were at these protests. I mean, you obviously live in Los Angeles, and you've got, you were there. So
Yeah.
I followed the profile, or your profile, because I thought that it
Mm.
would be so interesting. I mean, when I sit and work every day, I've got my desk set up, and then in front of me,
Right.
I've got this big TV that's on BBC for most of the day. And
Right.
I can, especially during Black Lives Matter, I was seeing a lot of news about it as it was developing. So I thought, let me follow someone who's on the front lines and be
Right.
able to compare what's going on this guy's Instagram story versus what's being shown on the news. And I noticed
Hmm.
some very, very distinct differences. Um, and I also heard you talking about these differences because I mean, there was that one clip where you were being like you were walking and you were being interviewed by someone, and they asked you a question about just generally what do you have to say, and one of the things that you mentioned was
Hmm.
that the media portrayal of what was going on was very different from what was actually happening, and I
Right.
could definitely see that in the difference between the stories and the what was being shown on BBC. So talk to me a little
Yeah.
bit about you know your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Jubilee video, I'll just say this really quickly. Um, that video, it's so funny because even like a year after it has happened, I have gotten like so many DMs about it. Some have been very, very funny and positive, and others have been a little less than that. Maybe that's an understatement. But I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point. But it was very hilarious. I enjoyed the process. Um, and honestly, it was really a lesson in like, which is it's funny because this is a nice little segue into what we're about to talk about. It was really a lesson in media and perception, um, and the way that people perceive things to be based off of what is shown to them. They may not have all the context, they may not have all the knowledge about an event, but the way things are edited, or the way things are shot, or the way things are talked about from a certain opinion, that can really shape people's perspective. And so, kind of pivoting now into the Black Lives um, Matter protest and the George Floyd situation. For me personally, um, I remember when Ahmaud Arbery died, or at least when we found out that he died, because we didn't even know that he had died for some time. Um, when I found out about that and I saw the video and I watched it, um, I was depressed. And I know a lot of people, they might say, "Oh, it's just really terrible. That's an awful thing that happened." But I believe that what a lot of people, that especially people that are not black, or people that go through this with the police, do not understand is that this is not just a special case. It's not like an isolated event. These are not like little things that happen every once in a while. Um, this is something that people in the black community, we understand what this is like, right? We know people that have personally died, that they weren't supposed to be famous for dying. They weren't supposed to be a name that you hear about in a hashtag on the news or a special case. These are average, ordinary people. And so, what this kind of invokes in you is a sense of it could be me, it could be my mom, it could be my dad, it could be my brother, my sister, or my best friend. And each and every one of those lives has a name. They have a story. They have a future. They have a purpose. And so, for me, watching those videos over and over and over again and seeing it replayed, it kind of made me feel depressed. And this was like right at the beginning of the pandemic. But then when I saw the video of George Floyd, I got angry. And like I said, this is stuff I've known about my whole life. Like, growing up, you hear about these stories, right? You hear your parents give you the talk about, like, hey, if you're stopped by the police, keep your hands on the wheel. Don't reach for something quickly. When you go in a store, don't put a hoodie on your head. Don't put your hands in your pocket. Like, these are conversations you hear as young as like 5, 6 years old, which a lot of people that are white, they may not have context for that type of stuff because that's just not their reality. But for me, uh, actually going and being in the middle of a protest, I did not expect to experience the type of hostility that I experienced. And so we went out there, and there were probably like, I would say there were probably like tens of thousands of people on the first day of the protest when I was out there. And so naturally, I'm like, let me get my phone out. I want to record what's going on, because this is a moment of history that, once you've got this, no one can take it from you. And you have that experience you can share with other people. And so, there were a lot of people that I was getting text messages from, phone calls from while I was at the events, like, why are you out there? Like, there's a bunch of rioting and looting going on. Why are you out there doing that? And I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, I'm out here on the ground. And apart from like a couple of individuals who a lot of people that were part of the movement or the protest were trying to stop from the rioting and looting, everybody for the most part was headed in one complete direction, trying to forward the conversation and really bring awareness to what was going on. And so when I saw that, I'm like, no, I have to document this. So I have my phone out, I'm recording what's going on. um, and I remember going home and watching videos from the media just talking about, oh, someone set a car on fire, and then the police then acted, and there are people being like aggressive, and there was some of that going on. But there was this one police car that I saw, and it was an old police vehicle, and the police vehicle just ended up in the middle of the street. And so it was really suspicious to us, because we were like, okay, wait a minute, how many times do you see a cop car that is not occupied by a police officer when you have tens of thousands of people in the street, and it's an old cop car? And then there was a group of four people who, in a minute, it literally went from being just randomly in the middle of the street to being set on fire. And people had like bottles of oil that looked like water bottles, and they poured it in and set the thing on fire. So we all thought that was kind of sus. And then after that, the police just showed up, and then they started like shooting at people with rubber bullets and tear gas. And so I was in the moment, and I started filming it. And so, I almost got shot at with a rubber bullet. I remember, I'm just walking, a group of us have our hands up. One guy, he gets pepper sprayed in the face. He was just chanting, had his hands up. The police officer pulled his mask down, maced him in the face. I saw people getting beat. And there was one particular time where I got I got pepper spray, or not pepper sprayed, sorry, I got tear gassed several times with a group of people that were just, marching forward. And so when I saw what happened, and then I was getting phone calls from like my mom, my dad, they're like, why are you even out there? And then I started telling them what was going on and sending them raw footage. That then started changing the narrative. And I started kind of calling out the media because of the way they were reporting what was happening. And so when that lady came up to me, who I didn't even know she was CNN, actually, I was kind of surprised at the end of it to find out it was CNN. But I basically called it out. I'm like, you guys need to do a better job at reporting, because you're not really telling the full truth. Because let's be honest, peaceful protests don't bring about ratings. It's not exciting to see tens of thousands of people marching in the street over something that they're being peaceful about. And so, I felt like it was almost my responsibility to not only kind of document what was going on, but to also stand up and say, you know what, this is not being reported right. It's not being reported fairly. And we need to have people accurately talking about what's happening in this movement.
I see. It's actually so interesting because police brutality is something that happens across the world. We had a case here a couple of years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was nicknamed afterwards the Marikana massacre. And I
Mm,
don't know if it was probably on the news at a point. And basically, what happened was there's a place obviously called Marikana, and it's a mining area. And what happened
yeah.
was there was a big strike with loads of mine workers who were striking for better wages and so on. And I mean, our police force in South Africa is predominantly black.
Mm,
So this was, sort of a black on black situation. It wasn't necessarily, a racial situation. But basically,
hmm
what happened was these mine workers were striking for several days or weeks, for better wages. The police sort of showed up at the area, and they did, as far as I can remember, and I could be wrong, but they did, the standard crowd control sort of
Right.
things with the rubber bullets and so on. But at some point, something just switched, and they started shooting live ammunition
Mm,
at the protesters. So many people died, and it was it was a dominating headline in South Africa for many weeks, talking about exactly what happened and
mhm,
who made the decision to shoot with live ammunition, because it wasn't just like one guy decided to
right.
or made a mistake. It was a commanding officer who gave a command saying, everyone switch out the rubber bullets for real bullets, and
Yeah.
shoot at these mine workers. So obviously there's a bit of a problem with police
Yeah.
across the world. We've seen recently, again in Brazil, there have been some major issues with regards to police brutality, but we see it all the time. So
Right.
when other people discuss this, I was listening to Joe Rogan talk to Jocko Willink about this a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about how when you're in the military, you spend, I think they said something like a quarter of your time training. So
Right.
out of every 4 days, obviously it won't be, every Monday you're training and the rest of the week you're working, but it's structured in such a way that out of a year you'll spend at least 3 months training. So you're
Mhm.
constantly honing all your skills. You're making sure that your combat skills are up to scratch. You're making sure that your situation de-escalation skills are up to scratch. And you're getting a lot of new content all the time, new decisions being made within the military and so on. Now, if we look at the police, the situation looks very different, because police are trained
Right.
once and then never again, which means that someone who's been on the police force for 10 years or 20 years is dealing with vastly outdated information. So, you know, having been in such close contact with the police during cases where police brutality was a major issue, what is your opinion? What is your feeling around how police reform happens in a way that
Right.
is realistic and then also effective?
Yeah. I think that is such an important, really, way to come about it, because it's crazy how you can look at the comparisons between the United States, Brazil, um, as you said, South Africa. Excuse me. And I've even looked recently at Nigeria and what's going on in Nigeria right now. And so I think you have to look at it from a couple of different points of view. The first one is, yes, there is an issue of police brutality. Police brutality is not an American thing. We know that police brutality happens all over the world. Um, but I believe that um, to talk about police brutality in general, I want to talk about it at least from a local perspective, and then we can talk about it from like a global perspective. Um, in America, police brutality, there's a history of police brutality being largely racialized. And excuse me, we've seen that same thing, even, I mean, in South Africa. I mean, I don't know everything about the history in South Africa, but I have studied about what happened during apartheid and how the police basically handled people of color in South Africa. And if you really look at it, a lot of the ways that the police handled people of color in South Africa is very similar with like the Jim Crow laws and segregation. A lot of the ways that the police handle people in South Africa is very similar to the way they handle them in the United States. And so if I look at what's happened here, the earliest examples of what we saw as police were people that were slave catchers. And they would go to basically round up slaves, and they would use obviously dogs, to catch their scent on a trail. And so we saw there's a very, very tense and racialized history to the way that police officers have dealt with people of color. Now, is every situation of police brutality that happens limited to racism? Absolutely not. There are layers to this. There are people, they don't have good training, or they don't they don't have enough discipline in cases where they might have behavioral issues, or there's not enough mental health training for people to have a certain level of understanding and empathy for some of the people that they're stopping. Because your motto is supposed to be, and we hear this all over the country here in the US, to serve and protect. But the first thing that you say is to serve. And so before you go into trying to protect, and I get that, there are officers out there, you're going into a hostile situation, you don't know what's going to happen. You might be in the mindset of, I want to go home to my family. But there are individuals out there, they arrive on the scene, they escalate things, and then out of that aggressive escalation, then now there's this, like, things go from one level to the next. And then you've got fear from the people, you've got fear from the police, and then people are taking certain actions. And then you just have people that are straight out racist. They have racist backgrounds, they have racist ideologies. We've caught police officers, calling Black people the N word on, their radio comms. There was one video I remember watching of this officer. He was like, this white woman, she got pulled over on the freeway, and I think this might have been in Georgia, but he was like, yeah, she was like kind of nervous. He was like, yeah, give me your license and registration. And she was like, yeah, well, I'm trying to be careful because, I've seen a lot of videos about people getting shot by the police. And he literally follows that up by saying, yeah, well, we only do that to Black people. All the people pretty much you see in those videos are Black. And so that within and of itself, those examples that we see are statements of the racialized aspect of what has happened here in the country. Even with the white neighborhoods, when the Federal Housing Authority, a lot of people don't know this in America, but when the suburbs were created after the military built the highway system in the United States, and then the Federal Housing Authority was created in the 1930s. What ended up happening is now people began to say, okay, wait a minute, we can move into our own neighborhoods. We can have our own neighborhoods. And what they basically told people is, hey, if you're white, don't sell your house to a Black person. So if you want to move out, don't sell your house to a Black person. Or if you are white and you want to move into a minority area, they were redlined areas, which we're still dealing with today. So all of that affects police enforcement. Because now if I'm a police officer and you're Black and you're walking in a so-called white neighborhood, when I show up on the scene, my thought process is, you're not supposed to be there. So the way I'm going to approach you is going to be more aggressive. And this happened to me and my brother one time where, I remember we were living in Illinois, and my parents went to go visit a friend that lived in Wheaton, which is a predominantly white kind of area. And so we show up, and my parents are hanging out with their friend. And so my brother and I, we decided to go walk around the neighborhood. Well, as we're walking around the neighborhood, I saw this man tailing this girl, this little girl. And I did not know, because it didn't seem like she knew him, but it was like for every kind of couple steps she was taking, he was kind of like a certain level of distance behind her. So I'm like, okay, I'm not an adult. I'm probably like 16, maybe 17 at the time, but I'm like, this looks a little sus. So I'm just kind of walking, just kind of seeing what's going on. And so next thing I know, I just both me and the guy and my brother, we stopped at a light. So we just started talking to the guy, just trying to, maybe delay him because we weren't really sure what was going on, but it looked a little sus. The police officer, after the guy, goes his separate way from us, the police officer stops me and my brother. And so we were just like, literally, he comes up, blocks us on the curb, and then another cop shows up, and then another cop shows up, and we're like, what's going on? And the cop is like, what are you guys up to? And we're like, we're going for a walk. He's like, you're going for a walk in jeans? I'm like, yeah, what do you want me to wear? Underwear? Like, to go for a walk, you know? And then he's basically asking us these questions like, I want to see your ID. Do you live here? Things like that. And so, then the police, they get out the car. One guy's got his hand on he's got his hand on his gun, belt. And so all of those things, as people, we are, as individual civilians, we're not trained to deal with that level of intensity. That stuff creates a level of fear. That stuff creates a level of nervousness. Police officers, they are trained to deal with these tense situations. So what ends up happening is that stokes a level of fear. It stokes a level of nervousness. And so to your point about, police officers being trained like guys in the military, I don't think it's just an issue of people just not being trained. I think sometimes what you have is there are systems that have been in place where, if there might be cops that are not racist, but if you have a system that's in place that has been a part of endorsing racism or that has served racism, then what ends up happening is that you might have cops that are great cops, but they're in a bad system. And so by definition, that ends up spoiling their ability to act in a way that is just and moral and right. And so I would definitely say we need to have better mental health training. We need to have better systems of vetting for police officers that are in the situation. That same feeling of fear that you have when you speed down a freeway going, maybe 30, 40 miles over the speed limit where you're nervous that a cop might pull up, a cop needs to have that same feeling of fear where they think twice before they, brutalize an individual or think they're above the law. In the United States, there's this thing that we have called qualified immunity. Whereas a cop, if you do something wrong, you can use the justification of, well, I felt threatened or my life was at risk. Or you're justified by the police because all the investigations run through the police department. So I think we have to have a better way of dealing with that in the country. And we need to have more people that are on watch to say, look, if there's a first responder that's coming to someone who has a mental health issue, we're going to bring that person in that's an expert. They are going to come alongside that police officer. They're going to try to de escalate, especially if somebody has like a knife or they have a gun. Our goal is not to kill people. You're not supposed to just go out there indiscriminately shooting at people, And then I would say on a global level, with what's going on around the world, I think that in a lot of ways in other countries, sometimes there's not necessarily been a governmental standard, right? Where people are being held across the board for a standard of, hey, if you don't handle things a certain way, we are either going to cut funding to you or we're going to begin to fire certain people. And so because, whether the government is behind that or the police force is behind that or commissioners are behind that, there's a system of it doesn't matter what you do, you're not held accountable. So I think a lack of accountability leads to that brutalization. So for me, whether it is racialized or whether it's just something that is systemic, I think all over the world, when we see things happening in the US where people are rising up and saying this is not okay, or people are rising up in Nigeria saying this is not okay, or people are rising up in Brazil saying this is not okay, all of us need to stand in solidarity with that to say police brutalization anywhere is an affront to us everywhere.
I see. I understand. I I think it's really interesting to hear your opinion on this. So, what do you think? You've now given me a certain image. How do you think that the image portrayed by the media differs from that? Do you think that they will highlight, these, like you said earlier, there's individuals who, um, who loot and who riot, who are then
Right.
highlighted by the media? How, you've spoken about why you think the media blows things up is for ratings, but how do they actually go about doing that? How do they make sure that they're in the right place at the right time to see the violent side of the protest?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's so much an issue of them trying to be in the right place at the right time. I think what happens is, you kind of know how this works. If there's tension going on, if you have people that are outside with the issue as, I mean, if you look at it historically, we know specifically here in the US, race has been something that has been at the forefront of so much tension for both sides for such a long time. The media knows this. So if you have a protest over someone being killed and people are angry about that, which a lot of times people tell you you can't be angry or they're trying to tell you how to protest or what to feel, which is funny in and of itself because you can't tell somebody how to protest. But um, if you see that tension, by definition, if you are rolling a camera or you are recording an event, there's bound to be a group of people that are more angry or people that are more frustrated than others that would even resort to a certain level of violence, right? Or a certain level of aggression. So by definition, because you know the history, you can almost predict an event, right? You can almost it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so what ends up happening is these people, yeah, they show up, they get tons of footage of what's going on. But it's all about what they choose to show. And I'll tell you, because we have so much media here, where they have conservative media, where there's people that, they have money, they own corporations, they will purchase, domains, and they'll have media that speaks to a conservative point of view. You'll see it. For example, you watch Fox News, you see that they will cover stories. They will be in the same location as CNN or MSNBC, but they will cover a story and they'll find something that happens that shows, for example, I saw this all throughout the summer. They will show people beating police, or they will show police trying to help a store owner after their business has been destroyed by a rioter or a looter. And then they'll cover that story. Or they'll show someone setting a police precinct on fire. Or they'll show pictures of, maybe on a different aspect of it, police kneeling and praying with protesters. And so, because they know in the United States of America, more of the conservative point of view is more pro police. It's kind of, like pro Second Amendment, kind of all that whole thing with law and order, as we've kind of seen the position of this current administration and everything like that. They know that's going to speak to their base. And then they also know that seeing people engage in a violent way about this movement is going to stir up feelings as well, because it creates a debate. So they'll air that. But then on the flip side, you have MSNBC, you have CNN, all these other people. What they're going to show you is they're going to mostly show you the police beating somebody up. They're going to show you the police standing there where people are peacefully having their hands up and they're macing people in the face. So it's very interesting to me that it's not so much, trying to be in the perfect place at the perfect time to just look for something, but they know, okay, if you bring tens of thousands of people into a particular location with the historic feelings around the issue of race as they are, and the tension of what is occurring in this country right now, you're going to have a bunch of people that feel a certain way about it. And then, as we know about the herd or the crowd, if one person does something, you're going to have a certain amount of people in the group that engage in that action. And so I think what ends up happening is the media, they know what's going to get them ratings. They know what's going to get them clicks. They know what's going to get them views. And so for me, what kind of frustrates me about the media's part that gets played in this, we talk about the divide all the time. We talk about healing the divide. And then what we'll do is we'll point fingers at a certain person. Well, for example, Donald Trump or the Republicans are the part of the divide. Or, Joe Biden and the Democrats, they're trying to cause the divide. And yes, this president in this country has been extremely responsible for the divide with the language. But so are the Democrats in Congress. And so are the Republicans. And a bigger player in it is the media. The word media means the middle. And it's amazing because that word media comes from the word median. That word media was supposed to help us find a middle ground to be able to discuss things. But now media has become so partisan where literally you're standing on one side of one media and it's left, or one side of one media and it's right. And to be quite honest with you, I think that even the whole, we've gotten so opposed to one another that it's almost led us to like a sense of tribalism, where it's like, if you don't agree with me, you're on this side. And if you don't agree with me, you're on that side. Where really, quite honestly, I think that there are people out there that are just like, I have a bunch of opinions on a lot of different things. And, maybe my perspective is a little more conservative on this side, but maybe my perspective is a little more liberal on this side, but I'm a human being and I care about certain issues. And I just don't want to be labeled as being this or that because I have a certain perspective. But the media kind of promotes this ideology that you're this or you're that if you're on one side or the other. And so now what it leads to is we don't have enough common ground. We don't have a basis for common ground anymore because we're all just listening to the people that espouse our beliefs and our ideologies. And so I think that that's what you begin to see when you watch a certain outlet that's showing you the police beating people up. You're like, see, I already knew that. And here's the deal. All of it, what you're seeing on the ground, it's actually happening. But does that represent a lot of the people in our movement? Absolutely not. Because I was out there on the street, man. I'll tell you this, and then I'm done. I saw a lot of people out there on the street. There were people out there just like myself that were stopping other people from rioting and looting because we're like, listen, man, this is gonna contaminate the movement and the message we're trying to make out there. And there were police officers themselves that were smashing windows. Police officers that went into a CVS and destroyed the windows of a CVS and were taking water bottles and giving them out to each other. So I think that, if we're going to talk about stuff that's going on, I think the first step in us making a difference and actually trying to fix what's going on in our society and all the division, we've got to call out the media and hold the media more accountable for reporting the whole truth.
I have to tell you, I mean, watching the news over the past few months, something that has become extremely evident to me in this time is that, I mean, at least this year, the United States, ironically,
It feels like that. It feels like everything other than the United States. I'll tell you that.
I mean, despite the name United, it seems to be
Hmm.
the single most divided country in the world right now. And I was watching a comedy special a while ago. What's the guy's name? He's an Australian guy. He's so funny. I can't remember. Maybe his name will come back to me. But he was talking
When you
about
find
the
that, let me know because I would love to listen to some comedy that's outside of this country. I'm telling you that right now.
yeah, he's an Australian guy, and he did a little bit of a bit about, because he became famous because he did a bit about gun control,
Hmm.
and that bit went completely viral. I can't believe his name, Jim Jeffries, I think is his name.
Yeah. Okay. I
Yeah,
think I've
so
heard of him. I
yeah,
think
yeah.
I've heard of him.
So I mean, he's brilliant, and he then spoke in one of his news specials. He was talking a little bit about the dividedness in the US, and he said that the problem right now is that no one agrees on the two major issues. Now, obviously, the two major issues that split the Democrats and the Republicans, at least from an outsider's point of view, are abortion laws and gun control. So, I
Yeah.
mean, but those two things no one can agree on. So now you've got your red and your blue, and there's a very thick line between the two. In South Africa,
Right.
we don't have, I mean, abortion and gun control don't really come up here. We don't have, I mean, we don't have as much, um, we don't really have mass shootings. We have some gun violence,
Right.
but it's on a small scale. We don't really have mass shootings the way that you do in the US. So gun control doesn't really come up, and then also abortion doesn't come up at all. In South Africa, abortion is legal. It's been that way forever, and it's not. It's I don't think anyone's campaigning for it to change. But we have a
Right.
separate issue which creates a lot of divide, which is land reform.
Mm.
So basically, the land reform issue, just to explain it briefly, what's happened is obviously the entire country of South Africa and pretty much the entirety of Africa was obviously a fully black continent. There are no native white Africans from before the colonial era. So almost all
Right.
at the same time, people from Portugal, people from the Netherlands, people from uh, trying to think now, Spain, all sorts of
Hmm.
countries across Europe would send boats down full of people, and they would colonize parts of Africa. We call it the scramble for Africa.
Yeah. They
And
overstayed their welcome. Yeah.
so, well, I mean, I'm a direct descendant of that effort, because
Right.
my ancestors would have been part of the Dutch. The Dutch group who came
Right.
down. They settled at the Cape, and then they started out the idea. Because I mean, if you've ever looked at a world map, Africa is really big, and
Yes.
I mean, to travel by wooden sailboat around Africa took them months and months and months. So
Right.
I mean, obviously the Europeans wanted to get to India and back. So what they
Hmm.
did was, at least what the Dutch did, was in 1652 they created this little port at a place that we now call Cape Town, which is where I was
Yeah.
born. And they
Right.
then, they started a little town there, and slowly but surely they spread upwards. There was this big event that we all learn in school, which is called the Groot Trek, which translates to the big migration.
Hmm.
And basically, the people from the Cape moved upwards into the rest of South Africa, where I am right now, which is Johannesburg. And the Free State was an area that they started there. Yeah, my DIY light setup just fell apart, but I think I'm still all right.
You're even your light is like, SMH.
You know
Bad
what's funny?
move.
My
Bad move, guys.
my light is frustrated because it's heard this story so many times. The reason is, in South Africa we have to relearn South African history probably 6 times throughout our high school career, each time in
Mm.
depth, in more detail. So I do know the story really well. But
Well,
yeah,
we could
so
use some of that in the United States because it's like a lot of people don't even know the history.
is
So
it? That's
great.
interesting.
Oh
Well,
yeah.
we'll talk
Bring
about
bring
that in a
some of
second.
bring
Yeah.
some of that bring some of that advice to us, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, as good as it sounds, and it probably is good, but it's frustrating to students who have to do like the same chapters year after year.
Oh,
But
I'm sure.
yeah, but the point is, you know, we've now got this situation because white people arrived in South Africa. Then,
Right.
when the British colonized South Africa, they imposed apartheid. They sort of started it, which was the whole thing. I've said it now the way you say it, which is apartheid, but we don't call it that here. We call it apartheid,
Oh,
which sounds very funny to me. But yeah, the point
I
is,
was gonna say I will try to remember that because I'm probably not. You probably have to tell me that several times because I'm not gonna pronounce that right. It's dumb, so I don't mind. Apartheid is stupid, so. But
yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, so the point is, now today, we after 1994, which was the first democratic elections, it's been many years
Right.
ago, and now the situation is as follows. While apartheid was a thing, the
Hmm.
the people were moved into areas. It's like you were talking about earlier, where there are black communities or black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. That was part of our
Right.
law. I mean, we had laws saying black people are only allowed to live in this area, white people are only
Right.
allowed to live in this area, and so on. So they really, segregation it ran very deep. And there's still photos where you'll be able to find them on the internet, photos of bathrooms at like public parks, where the one side says non-Europeans and the other side says Europeans, and only white people were allowed to go into one side of the bathroom, only black people into the other,
Mm.
and so on. So now a lot of the black people who were moved into these black areas are upset because now it's 30, 40, 50 years later. They now, or in some cases much longer than that, and they now want this area of land back, which their ancestors lost. But now the problem is, in some cases you've got wide areas of land which white people have been occupying for 3 generations, or more.
Right.
It's like, this is my grandpa's land. He bought it from the government. It wasn't a case of white people came in and chased them off the land. Maybe the government did that, but the people who own the farms now bought it legally from the government. So they have the legal deeds. They've been living there for many, many years. So
Yes.
it's created a very complicated situation because no one can really decide where the land should go. So the point
Yeah.
is, based on that issue, we have quite a few political parties. I think there are probably three that people would call major political parties, arguably four.
Hmm.
But the point that I'm trying to get to in this whole long story is that each party gets a lot of media time. Parties address people very easily. They push their issues very easily, and also it's not uncommon for even parties who hate one another and who are very against one another on a lot of issues to work together on a lot of issues as well. I mean,
Right.
I see it pretty often in the news and on social media where we've got two parties which are about as far away from each other as can be, which are the EFF and the DA. And
Mm.
they very often will work together on municipal issues and so on. So,
What does that stand for, by the way? The EFF and you said DAA, right?
yeah, DA. So EFF stands
Oh.
for Economic Freedom Fighters. They're a pretty
Hmm.
new party. I think they are
Okay.
probably 5 years old or so, maybe a
Okay.
little bit more. But the EFF was basically a result of frustration with the current governing party, which is the ANC, the African National Congress. Now, the ANC
Yes.
came into power in 1994 with Nelson Mandela, and since then, they've ruled. There haven't been any other parties, and then the DA,
Right.
which stands for the Democratic Alliance, is the official opposition. So then the EFF basically was a group of people who were within the ANC. They became extremely frustrated. They broke off and started their own party, and they took a lot of their
Right.
followers with them. Um,
Right.
so, yeah, we've got a lot of parties, but regardless of the fact that they disagree so fundamentally on a few issues, and regardless of the fact that they stand for such, different ideas, we don't
Right.
have polarization even close to the extent that you see in the USA. I mean, it's not even
Right.
close. So it's interesting because we come from a history where just 30 years ago we lived in a society where by law black people were oppressed. But now, 30 years later,
Right.
even though a lot of people say that there hasn't been much progress made, if you hold up a candle to the US, the situation in the US seems to be much worse, despite the fact that the US's laws and the Jim Crow laws regarding oppression have been gone for a lot longer. So the
Right.
question I'm trying to build up to is, why do you think that the racial tension in the USA has prevailed for so long? And why do you think it's still so intense? I mean,
Right.
arguably, as to some extent, as intense as it was right after the laws were abolished, right after the Civil War and all that.
Well, first of all, man, I want to say just thank you for giving me that little bit of like education on what's going on in South Africa, because personally, this is something that I really like to do. I like to look at what's going on in other parts of the world, especially in comparison to what's happening in America, and say, okay, how can we look at what other people are doing and find a solution? I think in a lot of ways, here in the US, we kind of tend to think that our way is the way. And it's that level of arrogance, I believe, that stops us from, being able to learn from other places. Even the statement, the greatest nation on earth, right? Well, that is the most subjective statement in the world, right? And obviously there are opportunities in America, and we're grateful for those opportunities, but I believe that opportunity should never stop you from stepping out. Having a wide breadth of opportunity should never stop you from stepping out into innovation and from learning from other people about how to do things. So I just want to thank you for giving me that perspective, because if you look at South Africa in terms of what's happened, like you said, it's only been like at least 30, 40 years since a lot of these things have changed. Whereas the United States, we're kind of knocking on the door of like kind of like 50, almost 60 years. And so I would definitely say, just to now pivot into the second part, the reason that I think that the tensions are so high here in the United States is number one, if you really look at the highest level of tension that we dealt with in this country, but besides slavery and all that other stuff, but I'm talking about more of, you have two people that are standing on both sides of an issue, um, or two different groups that are standing on both sides of an issue. And one group is asking for civil rights, and there's another group that's trying to deny people civil rights. Um, that brought about a very, very high level of tension, because you started seeing the character of the country, right? In the 1960s, we saw the character of this country. Um, Ultimately, we got civil rights in America. But if you look at the situation that happened, it took a lot of economic damage, excuse me, in this country to bring about civil rights, right? So with the bus boycotts, they didn't desegregate buses until the economics were affected locally. When people decided, we're not going to ride on your bus, which is really funny to me, that if you have the majority of black people riding on your bus, but you're segregating them on your buses, you're going to disenfranchise the majority of people that are riding on your buses, right? So then they were like, okay, cool, we're not going to ride on your buses no more. So then now you get disadvantaged because of that. And so you rise up against it, and then that affects the economics. So now people decide, okay, we're gonna desegregate this. After MLK died, and there were the 6 days of rioting that resulted in $40+ million in economic damages, and then the next Civil Rights Act in 1968 was passed. Then all of a sudden, you began to see that same facet prevailing. So much of America went into this era that we call the colorblind ideology era. And that colorblind ideology era, excuse me, was what led to people just acting like the issue of race went away. And then, and hey, white people were not the only ones that played a part in this. Black people did too, because they were saying, okay, wait a minute, we've been told that we can't participate in society, or we cannot be, we can't be successful in business or whatever. So it was a different form of protest, but I believe our generation kind of left behind that direct form of protest, or the previous generation left behind a little bit of that direct protest that we are now picking up. And they did make gains for us, but what ended up happening now was is that you have white people working alongside black people, and now people just start thinking, okay, well, we're going to be politically correct. You know, we're not gonna talk about race. We're gonna act like everything's gone away because now a black man can be a CEO, or a black woman can be very, very successful in her own business. And so what you start seeing is more subtle versions of racism. Now what you start seeing is people saying, "Oh, you can't come to work," or "I'm going to kick you out of class," or "I'm going to be tough on you in class as a black woman because your hair looks a certain way." Right? And so I'm not going to let you work here if your hair looks a certain way. Or yeah, you can come and work at this job, but if you interview for a higher position, you may or may not get it based off of the fact that you might have a black sounding name. Right? And so what ends up happening is these racial attitudes start kind of going into hiding. These racial attitudes start getting a little bit more quiet, and they start getting a little bit more subtle because of the fact that now you've got people that they can't so outwardly profess this level of racism that they're used to professing because legally it's not right. And so now what you start seeing is as a society, we're starting to move closer and closer to this more hidden version of racism. So when people say, "Oh my goodness, it's 2012," or "It's 2020," or "We elected a black president," and we've made so much progress. Yes, we've made progress on the surface, and maybe legally things have changed. But when we see a person like Donald Trump come out and he's making a lot of these statements that are inflammatory, and you start seeing, the KKK comes out and endorses him, or you start seeing a lot of people telling people to go back to their country, or we start seeing police brutality, or people, feeling more empowered to do what they're doing, or laws start coming up, or the conversation about reparations, for example, which is probably very similar. It's a little different, but it's probably very similar to the feelings about land reform, um, because these attitudes were not directly addressed post the civil rights era, and because we're not necessarily having direct conversations. And a lot of times, in all honesty, you know, a lot of times I've seen this, and I've got a lot of white friends. I love my white friends, but I will say there's a level of uncomfortability that white people have. And I'm not just talking about people that are racist that are white, just people that are like, there's a level of uncomfortability regarding race. Now, I'm gonna say this because I think this is important to say, and then I'll go back to what I was saying. I am not pro, and I'm not an advocate for black supremacy. Because if we're out here trying to bring down white supremacy and the systems that support white supremacy, but then us as black people, or if there's, Latino people out here or whatever, we're out here promoting, black supremacy, or, Latinx supremacy, we are literally being counterproductive because we're turning around and erecting a new statute while we're tearing down the same one that we're trying to get rid of. So I'm not for any supremacy. We are all human beings. Racism is a total lie. It's a farce. It was created. And just like it can be created, it can be dismantled. But before something can be dismantled, we have to confront the foundation. And I find that a lot of times, a lot of white people that I've talked to about racism, they're very uncomfortable talking about racism because what they want to do is they want to jump to, "Oh, well, that ended in the 1960s," or "We elected a black president," or, black people are they're getting all these opportunities. And so what I think that leads to is now there's this disacknowledgement. And so now when these situations happen in society, people say, "Oh, you guys just think everything's racist. Stop talking about these issues," which frustrates us as black people because for the most part, we would like to forget about this stuff. We would like to just live every day where we're not dealing with these particular issues. And so I think that the reason why you see all the tensions that you're seeing about issues, that it should not be a white versus black thing. It should be like us arm in arm saying this is a human problem. Because what affects black people affects white people, right? If there are more white people that are coming out and being outwardly racist towards black people, that's going to affect white people because that's going to affect the way they're being perceived in society, right? But then if there are a bunch of black people that are going around destroying stuff in neighborhoods, right, that are while we're protesting, then that kind of affects a bunch of people, not just white, but even people that are like, "Well, I don't believe in looting and destroying stuff." even though I want change to happen, it causes a problem for the way that we're perceived in society. And so I think that, this should not be a black or white or Republican or Democrat issue. This should not be a party issue. We should not be disenfranchising one race over the other or talking about making partisan discussions about whether or not we should have reform or whether one side supports the police or another. Because if you see a problem anywhere, we should be addressing it. And I think that's just the biggest problem that I see. Certain people, they will hide behind their political affiliation, or they will hide behind, well, I believe in this, or I'm a this, or I support this position, to almost defend not calling out what's wrong and standing up for what they see is clearly right. Like when you see people say, oh, clearly what happened to George Floyd is horrible, but why are people rioting and looting? What people should be saying is the rioting and the looting is terrible, but what happened to George Floyd, people are fed up. There are some people out there, as MLK said, listen, riots are the language of the unheard. Are we condoning riots? Are we condoning, looting and all that other stuff? Absolutely not. But my thing is this: back when people were peacefully marching in the '60s, and they were just asking politely for freedom, they had dogs sicked on them. They had hoses turned on them. They were beaten and they were maced, right? Just politely asking, not being violent, just politely asking, not for human rights, but for civil rights. Then we fast forward. You have people that are, today they're asking, hey, please stop killing us by the police. You have somebody like Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee, which, by the way, a lot of people say is disrespectful to the flag. But Colin Kaepernick literally asked a military officer what the most respectful way to protest would be. And he got that direction from a military officer. And so you take a knee and during the national anthem, and people say you're being disrespectful, even though you're peacefully protesting police brutality. So people tell you that's not the right way to do it. So it's almost like that example that Tupac gives, where it's like, hey, you're starving over here on one side, and you go knock on the door, and you ask politely. After a couple of times, you're not going to be polite about it anymore. So my thing is like, okay, yes, you can condemn the rioting and the looting, but why are people even feeling like they have to get to such a point where, when they've been asking and asking and asking, hey, please stop doing this, and the justice system has failed us and politicians have failed us, people are tired of it. And if you look at any other time in history, it's the last thing I'll say, you look at any other time in history, every other revolution that has happened in the world, you look at what happened in Cuba, you look at what's happened all over the place. This country went to war. People in this country, before the country was a country, when they were being oppressed by the British government, nonviolent oppression, by the way, just regarding no taxation without representation, this country literally went to violent conflict. They went to a war. They went to an actual war over nonviolent oppression. And the new nation that we tout as the greatest nation on earth, land of the free, home of the brave, was born out of struggle and violence and revolution. But there are people that, they might rise up. If you look at any revolution all over the world, no revolution has pretty much been successful without some form of violence or struggle. But then people that are out here, they're rising up, and you basically are treating them as illegitimate. That just creates more frustration and more tension. So I think that, in my personal opinion, I think that's why we see so much tension in the US, because A, it's not been dealt with. B, whenever it's brought up, it's kind of dismissed in some sort of way as, oh, that was a long time ago. C, people in many ways do not respect people in the Black community, because right now we don't have a lot of wealth because of things that have happened. And then D, I think what has happened is now it has become partisan debates about race instead of looking at civil and human debates about race. And that's why I think the tension is so strong.
I see. I have to agree with you, especially on the point of that guy who took a knee. I had a big disagreement with someone over on this side about that, because obviously when it happened, it made the news, and we had a chat about it. And he said to me, you shouldn't bring politics into sports. There shouldn't be any politics in sports. We should just. And then I said to him, like, what do you want them to do? Like, if you can't do, I mean, sporting platforms are probably one of the biggest public platforms where you can make a statement both locally and internationally. And I mean, you said his
Right.
name is Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely he achieved the effect he was going for because it made international news. It did exactly what it was meant to. It drew a lot of attention. So I mean, all around the world, everyone has an opinion on this, and a lot of people were so anti this whole idea. And we've had things happen
Yeah,
like that in South Africa before as well, where people had activist and protesting displays during sporting
right.
events, and there's always people who say politics should be kept out of sports completely. But you know, it's the best way to go about it. It's the best way to get
Yeah,
international attention. Of course, that's the right place to do it.
yeah.
And a lot of
Can,
people will
can, can,
disagree with me.
can I just add something really quickly to what you just said, because you just brought up something that's very, very important, and I didn't think of this before, but you kind of brought this to my thought process. This is the thing that I think is very interesting. When people tell you that, it's so funny when people tell people that are standing up for their rights with something, they tell you this is not the platform, this is not the place, this is not the time for something. I find it very, very interesting. If you really look at the Black community and the opportunities, obviously the opportunities have been growing. As we've seen, there's more opportunities for the Black community in America to basically kind of make their voices heard, or to even be successful. They're growing. But if you look at primarily what has happened, a lot of Black people in the United States, they found a tremendous amount of success through entertainment, right? And this is what I like to call, there's a term I like to call this. I call this cultural or racial colonization, and where it's not colonization of land, but it's almost colonization of the individual, where you literally take somebody that's a figure, right? That they've worked hard, whether it's in sports or entertainment, or acting or music or whatever. Because if you really look at it, in a lot of places that Black people have been most notable in, it's been in the arts, whether that's music, that's dancing, that's acting, that's comedy, particularly in the areas of comedy, or it's in the areas of sports. If you look at the NBA, NBA is primarily or predominantly African American, right? If you look at the NFL, predominantly African American, right? And so if you're looking at these sectors, these groups are predominantly Black, but the ownership is predominantly white. And you're looking at it, you're saying, okay, wait a minute. Most of these dudes are playing. They have a lot of experience. They've played the game, but when they apply, or they're trying to buy a team, or they're trying to get involved in that, they're not being considered seriously. And there are many conversations that have happened about this. But then when somebody who's Black, who is playing a sport, and these situations are affecting them and their community, they say, wait a minute, I realize that I have a platform, and I'm going to use my platform. They're being told, oh, keep sports out of or keep politics out of sports. That is literally silencing somebody's freedom. And I think what happens is people are not saying keep it out of sports because it's not the place. People feel uncomfortable. I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine. We're sitting down chatting about this, and I was saying, we were looking at this thing where LeBron James, because we were watching the NBA Finals. It was the Lakers were playing against Miami Heat, and I was kind of talking about how LeBron James is he's a very controversial figure to some, because whether you love LeBron or hate LeBron, LeBron has really not only done a lot for the NBA, he's known all over the world, but LeBron has really stuck this social justice issue um, to people. And then there are people that say, "Oh, LeBron's not eloquent or whatever." I'm like, it doesn't matter whether he's eloquent or not. He's bringing attention to an issue. Because then you look at someone like Colin Kaepernick, who's very elegant talking about this issue, and then you guys want to kind of push him down. And Colin Kaepernick, for all intents and purposes, we have a term we like to say, "cut the cap" here in America. Well, Colin Kaepernick literally said, "Yo, y'all, cut the cap," because we need to talk about what's happening. And so these people, they're using their platform to say, wait a minute, I'm a figure, and I'm here, and people respect me all over the world, but I'm also Black. I'm a human, yes, but I'm also Black. And I have also been affected by these issues. We've had multiple football players in this country who, some play for the Seahawks, which is my favorite football team. Shout out to Seattle, where I used to live. But they were the Seahawks who, there's one player, I think his name is Michael Bennett. He went, and the police officer did not know that he was a football player. That makes millions of dollars, treated him a certain way, in a very aggressive way, then found out he was a football player, and his whole attitude changed. And so we're living in a country where, like I said, you don't have to be a special case. it doesn't matter if you got millions of dollars or whether you're known or not. For a lot of these athletes, this is their reality. And Stephen A. Smith, who is one of my favorite sportscasters on ESPN, he says this so commonly. He says, when white people go to work, they have a job. When black people go to work, they have a responsibility. And so anything, especially if you're a notable figure, whatever you have to say as a notable figure out there, because for every black person that's very successful and makes a lot of money, there are hundreds of white people, dare I say thousands, that you've never heard of. So when black people go on the job and they have some sort of fame or clout and they make a statement, that reverberates through our community. It makes us feel represented. And so people out there, they know that. So it makes them feel uncomfortable when something that they've been trying to hide or pretend like it's not an issue, or that makes them feel more conscious of the part that they now have to play in society, becomes more elevated. And so I just want to say that to your point, because you were kind of talking about, like, oh, people saying, like, oh, sports is not the place to talk about political issues. But if it's my platform and it's the only way that I have a voice to talk about it, I have a right, dare I say, a responsibility and obligation to stand up for what I believe in. Because here's the thing, if activism was good enough and I went to the legal system and I went to some of these corporations and I asked them to do it, if they had a conscience, they would have done it out of a conscience. So therefore, because you don't have a conscience and you won't do it out of a conscience, now I've got to invade every single sector of your entertainment. I'm going to invade sectors of your comfort to make you realize that what has been comfortable for you is not comfortable for me.
I agree. I also think if someone posts, so let's say I'm now a black person who has a message that I need to share with regards to an issue that is facing my community. If I were to go and post this on Instagram, for example, which a lot of people say, if you want to make a point, just post it on social media, and if it's a good
Mm,
point, it'll gain traction. The problem
right,
is, if I have, let's say I have 50,000 followers on Instagram and I go post it, those 50,000 people who are following me will most likely already agree with my message. So you're just
right,
shouting right into an echo chamber. You're talking into a bubble. And you're
right.
not
Preaching to the
going to
choir.
exactly, you're not going to get your message to people who haven't heard it yet, or people who don't quite understand. So now if you look at a
Right,
platform like sport, where sport isn't just a thing that's watched by one group of people, it's watched by everyone. Not only is it watched by everyone within a country, but I mean, the rest of the world doesn't watch American football and we don't watch baseball, but we do watch, the Olympics, for example, which
right,
Americans take part in all the time. So now you're talking to a global audience, and you're bringing
right.
international attention to your issue as well. So, on the point of representation, I want to mention something. I don't know if you've heard of this. The announcement that's been made by the Academy Awards a few weeks ago or months ago
Mm.
about the new rules for the new requirements. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, you're talking about, excuse me, you're talking about the, that was a non-COVID cough, I promise. Um, you're talking about the rules where you need to have a certain level of representation, I believe, for people of color, um,
Yeah.
in your films for it to qualify for an Academy Award.
Yes. So basically, the rule, I read about this in our campus newspaper at the university I go to. The rule
Okay.
is basically, or there's a couple of rules, and they differ by category. But for Best Picture, which is obviously Best Picture is the big one that everyone
Oh
really
yeah.
cares about the most. For Best Picture, the rule now is that it's not right away. I think it comes into effect in like 2023 or something like that, because they want to give
Hmm.
the industry some time to adapt. But
To
basically,
pivot, right,
so basically the rule is, if you want to qualify for Best Picture at the Academy Awards,
hmm,
your movie, I think it either needs to be about a minority, like it needs to be the story of a minority. So minority, obviously, in this case, means minority in the USA. Because
right,
minority in the USA does not apply to the rest of the world. So you need to be a person of
right,
color who isn't white, or you need to be a person who isn't straight. Okay, so or you need to be disabled. Like those are the three branches. So in order to qualify your movie for Best Picture, you have to have a story that is about either a
Right.
person of color, a person of different sexual orientation, or a person who is disabled, or you
Right.
need to either have the story be about that, or you need to have a person who falls into one of those categories in the lead role. So this is extremely controversial because
Yeah.
now the situation is again the narrative of, shouldn't the title of best picture go to the best movie? Shouldn't it go to the one that
Right.
is the most incredible film to see? What's your take on that? Do you think that enforced? I mean, in South Africa, we have what's called a quota system. So
Hmm.
this exists in our sports, especially. We've had this big scandal recently where a netball team. I don't know the whole story, so I might be wrong
Hmm.
about this, but netball. Do you guys have netball? I'm sure you do. Have you heard of it?
Netball. I I can't say that I have. What's the sport like? Like, how do y'all play?
So, netball in South Africa is a predominantly female sport, and
Okay.
it's very similar to basketball in a lot of ways. In order to score, you need to pass a ball through a hoop, which is, I think, it's about the same height as a basketball hoop. It's quite high.
Oh,
I
okay.
Yeah, but
So
there's
it's like
some difference.
basketball then.
Yeah, it's almost like basketball, but the difference is,
Okay.
once you have the ball, you can't run, you
Okay.
can't move, you have to stand in place. Only the
That
people
sounds
who
very
don't,
that sounds
yeah.
very frustrating.
Yeah. So only the people, there's no bouncing. Like you don't dribble the ball by yourself. You have to pass it to other people in order to
Oh,
keep moving forward. But yeah, the point is,
got it.
in our netball team, there was this big scandal because if I'm not mistaken, they did not abide by the quotas, which means they didn't have enough black players in the team. But then
Okay.
the netball team was saying, no one had communicated with them exactly what the quota is and so on. So netball has had the scandal, but this has existed in rugby for many, many years. So I'm sure you know what rugby is, at least.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That I do know.
So yeah,
I am familiar
rugby
with that.
rugby is arguably our biggest sport. I mean, we won the World Cup last year. In fact,
Right,
we
right.
just when was it? What day is it today? Today's Monday. On
Hmm.
Saturday morning, I spoke to Nas Botha, who's this like rugby icon in South Africa, this enormously important commentator who, he's one of the best rugby players of all time and just an incredible guy. But yeah, I'm getting off topic. The point is, we've got quota
Oh, this is great, bro.
systems.
I love sports. This is fantastic. Hey.
So yeah, we've got quota systems in place to make sure that there's a certain amount of players represented on the team. And
Right,
in the beginning, a lot of people were very upset because they were sort of like, why should a black person get chosen to play rugby for the national team, which is called the Springboks? Why should they
right.
play for the Springboks if they are not the best player? However, I mean, in recent years, the black players who've come into rugby have been like phenomenal. Some of the best players we've ever had. Even the
Right.
captain right now, Sia Khaleesi, is a black guy. But the point I'm getting to is, we've had quotas for a very long time in sports. Now you guys have something very similar to quotas in your entertainment and your film industry. Do you believe that it's a step in the right direction, or do you think that it's an unnecessary push that's going to create more tension than it alleviates?
Oh man. So this one's tough for me because I'm an actor as well. And I obviously live right here in LA, which is like the mecca of entertainment. Um, this kind of goes back to that idea of racial colonization or cultural colonization that I talked to you about, where it's like historically black people have been used for our talents, but then it's like who we are has not like it's not been allowed. Like it's like you take what you want from like the parts of, like, almost like if you look at, like, if you were trying to get like beef from a cow, right? You take all the parts you want and then you discard the rest, right? And I feel like that's how a lot of times we felt misrepresented or underrepresented. And so it's like, okay, well, if we really like this part, we'll keep it. If we really like this part, we won't. And so I feel like the biggest, I'll speak to the pros of it, right? I think as an actor, seeing a film like Black Panther, for example, I'll give it an example for that. That film obviously had a tremendous impact, not on just people of color here in the U.S., but people of color all over the world, to see themselves being represented in a way that was not based off of just a trope or a stereotype, but to see people as ordinary people, but also as those that were royalty, that were in positions of leadership, where they weren't given positions of leadership, or they weren't a sidekick or whatever, or they weren't the person that like dies off in the middle of a film, right? It doesn't really contribute much. They were seen as people that are like, nah, we have our own society, we have our own rules, we have our own laws, we have our own way of going about doing things. And so that representation matters, because that has a really huge impact on the way that you see yourself as a person, the way that you view yourself as a person, and the way that you see your level of success in society. So I do believe that, the only reason why we've ever had to be like this and have conversations about this is because of the fact that that representation has been denied. You've seen movies that have come out within the last, you know, 20, 30 years, more so in the last 20 years, where they've been phenomenal movies about people of color, or phenomenal movies about stories that have to do with people of color, and those movies have not been nominated for Academy Awards. They've not been nominated for Golden Globes. And so people, I think what you begin to see is there's a frustration with that, because people are like, okay, wait a minute, what is then enough, right? At what point does what we do become good enough? So I think that the pros of it is, you get more representation, you get more opportunities. Black people now are able to get, or actors specifically, they're able to get more roles, they're able to get more representation. I'm all for that. I'm all for us just being able to be treated as we always should have been. If you're good at something, you're good at it, and if your story makes a difference, it's good. Now, before I switch over to the second part, we've known historically in Hollywood that the statement was a movie that was led by Black actors, or a Black cast, or a story that represents Black people, was not going to get traction in Hollywood. It was not going to blow up. It wasn't going to be something that people from a wide variety of audiences will be able to digest. And of course, after Black Panther, we've seen that's not true. And so I think Black people, we want to we want to have movies about things more than slavery. I think it's cool to have stories that tell our stories about struggle, slavery, civil rights, all that other stuff. But we also want stories that show us as people, as individuals, as your next door neighbor, as your best friend, as the guy that makes you coffee at the local coffee shop, as the dude that has aspirations of becoming like, an NFL player, or as the guy that wants to own a company. Stories like that don't just show us as down at the bottom or somebody trying to save us. You know, and so that's the first part that I think is like a pro. It's a great aspect, not just historical pieces, but also characters we can make for ourselves, or we can envision heroes for ourselves. So that's one part. The negative of making this move for me is this. I believe that now what you can start seeing is people just making movies about something because of the financial edge that it brings, and not necessarily caring about the community, or not necessarily caring about the stories behind them, or the people behind it. And then what I think it can start leading to is people not just creating out of a sense of, I really want to tell this accurately, I really want to bring this story to life, or I really want to hire this cast because I love it, and I love them, and I love what is going to be told, by this group of people. It can just be, well, we have to meet a quota, or I have a motive of making my movie Best Picture, so I'm just going to hire a bunch of Black people and make a bunch of movies about Black people to tell a story. And I think that what that can start leading to is, people, getting chosen for a role or a film, maybe not necessarily because of their skill set, but because of the fact that, oh, okay, like they're Black, and we want to, excuse me, gosh, my throat's like, wow, we don't want to talk about this one. Um, but uh, it can start leading to a sense of um, just storytelling based off of race, and not necessarily based off of people putting value on that story. And so that to me detracts from it. And so I think we're going to have to, and obviously we'll see what happens, but in the next couple of years, I think there needs to be a very, very intense level of dialogue about maybe not so much the provision itself, but how we go about the provision. Because, you know, I think to me, JC, I'll tell you this, man. The fact that we have to mandate it, and the fact that we have to say you won't get Best Picture if you don't have this. We could talk back and forth about the pros and the cons of it, but the fact that we have it in place, that speaks to the heart of a problem that we're dealing with in this country. It speaks to the heart of the fact that there are certain people that are valued, and certain narratives and certain stories and certain characters that are valued over others. And to me, I think if we would get busy, not just making films that just spoke to the Black experience as a whole in total, and not just in parts and based off of tropes and scripts. But if we were actually to stop and say, you know what, this is my brother, this is my sister, this is my neighbor, it all boils down to that thing that says, love your neighbor as you do yourself, But I think a lot of this stuff is based off of, and even racism, a lot of it's based off of people don't love themselves. And so if people do not truly love themselves, they cannot effectively love other people. That's what this really boils down to. So they have to, lift themselves up, or lift one narrative up, or tell one story more than another, because of the fact that people truly do not love themselves. And so they have to exclude somebody else to feel more included. And so I think that we have to really start confronting more than just putting, that's important, and I believe in it, but more than just putting out stories that just represent people of color or whatever. We really have to get to this issue and confront this collective issue in society that's going to continue if we just ignore it on the surface, or deal with it at the surface, but ignore it at the lower level of just, okay, well, representation, let's just have more representation. We've really got to get to the bottom of this issue. Otherwise, it'll be representation, but will never fully be accepted.
I see. I I remember there was an interview that I watched a couple of years ago, which was so powerful. At least to me, I mean, this interview alone, it 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 became the foundation for so many of my opinions regarding
Mm,
how to deal with these issues. And the interview was with Morgan Freeman. And I don't know if you know what I'm
mm,
talking about, but he was having a conversation with a white journalist, and they were going back and forth, and they were talking about how to deal with the issue of racism in America and in the world as a whole. And the I can't remember what the white guy's name was. I think, let's say his name was John. And
mm,
the John asks Morgan Freeman, he says, so how do we move past racism? How do we abolish racism entirely? And Morgan says to him, we stop talking about it. We stop talking about it completely. I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man, and I will stop calling you a white man. I will call
mm,
you John, and you should call me Morgan, you know? And I thought that that was so incredibly powerful, because what what it what it means to me is that if we can remove the if we can remove the feeling of things being forced, I feel like
mm,
we can normalize it a lot. I remember there was so much. It's like night and day, the fan response to two different things that happen. So in in Avengers Endgame, there was the
yeah.
scene where all the female Avengers came together, and they fought together for just a few moments. However, the fan response to this was people were not happy. Like because it felt extremely forced, because it didn't fit in naturally with the story or the scene. It felt very it was sort of like very obvious what they were trying to do. And a lot of people find that frustrating, because especially when you go to the movies and you're sitting down and just trying to be immersed in this experience, something that can really pull you out of it is being reminded of an activist issue, which I think is a
Right,
lot of the way that people feel about sports as well. Then
right.
you look at a series, the one that was on Amazon Prime recently, called The Boys. Now, I love The Boys. It's amazing. It's
I haven't
fan.
watched it yet, but I've heard really good things about it.
You got
So
to see it, man.
that's on my next list.
No, it's
I'm
really
still trying to
good.
get through I'm still trying to get through Netflix stuff, bro. So, but that is on my list. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, so in The Boys, the story, the story goes, you've got a bunch of The Boys. Basically, the plot is that it's a group of people who are victims of superhero collateral damage. Um,
Hmm.
and it's sort of like what you were talking about police immunity in the US. The superheroes have immunity
Right.
in this show. So I mean, literally in one case, right at the beginning of the show, sort of the catalyst event that sets everything off is the one guy standing just talking to his girlfriend, and they're standing next to the street on the curb, and a superhero who has the same powers as the Flash comes just ripping around a corner, and he
Hmm.
crashes into her at whatever
Hmm.
speed he's going, and she just explodes into a million pieces. I mean, she's
Wow.
completely incinerated by this, or incinerated is the wrong word, but she's torn to shreds by this impact, but nothing
Right.
happens. The guy, he sort of, like, he reports it and nothing happens because it's a superhero. No one's going to prosecute a superhero. And eventually he just gets like a half-assed apology from the guy, sort of like, oh, sorry about your girlfriend, man. And that's
Right.
it.
Right.
So anyway, the story, it goes for a couple of seasons, and the just coincidentally, nothing about it feels forced, but the characters on the sort of good side, who are
Hmm.
immensely powerful, happen to be female characters. So the male
Yeah.
characters, all the people who are part of this force to hold superheroes accountable, are not superheroes themselves, but they befriend some superheroes who happen to be women. So
Right.
these female characters are extremely well developed, and at the end of, I think, season 2 or season 3, there's this really, really important and long awaited event where it's a fight between superheroes, and they just happen to all be women because that's who they are. These are the people who are qualified. Only the superheroes can fight other superheroes, so they happen to all be women. And I mean, they beat the shit out of each other. It's it's an incredible scene. And then it sort of pans back to one of the guys, and they've been standing there, they're like geared up, they've got these guns, and they've been trying their best, but I mean, their bullets are like BB guns, they're not doing anything. But when the superheroes come in, they are fighting on a different level. And the guy, there's
Right.
a character called Frenchie. He looks at them and he sort of goes, girls do get it done. And it's this tension breaking moment. But it
Right.
was
Right.
such the fan response to this scene was so positive, because it
Right.
felt natural, it felt
Right.
right, and it was deeply satisfying to see not characters fighting together because they were women, but characters fighting together because those characters worked together well. It made sense for that scene.
Right.
So I think that speaks a lot to this situation of introducing something similar to quotas to the film industry, because it's going to be a bit of a balancing act now moving forward, to make sure that things don't feel so politically correct that it's almost
Hmm.
off-putting, and make sure that the stories that are being told within the qualifications of the Academy Awards are stories that feel organic, and stories that
Right.
feel like they make sense, and so on.
Right.
So yeah. So
Actually, you know what? That's very interesting that you brought that up. I wanna slightly tackle that because I feel like we don't talk enough about this um in our culture because of the fact that I think people are so scared. People can't talk about anything anymore. And look, I think there's a huge aspect of accountability where, if someone is saying and doing things that are wrong, and we've seen a history of people saying and doing wrong stuff, we should hold them accountable for that, right? But um, what I'm starting to see is that if someone says anything, right, like not even says anything, I'll give you a perfect example. I literally saw this article the other day about the Mandalorian and how Baby Yoda was eating an egg on the Mandalorian, and some people were like saying, "Oh, that's like he's eating an egg of another like group or whatever," and it was a whole controversy because essentially, like, "Oh yeah, he's eating like baby eggs and it's Yoda, and that's just like that's not right." Like he's doing. I'm just like, it is a TV show. It is a TV show about another world. There's a fantasy world that someone is telling a story, about something. And I think I mean, don't get me wrong, there's some things that are logical that we should talk about and say, okay, hey, this is not cool, this is not right. But it gets to the point that everybody is offended about everything. Everybody is causing a controversy about everything. People will say one thing, they meant something else because you have 20, 30, 50, 20,000 other people that are out there. They're like, oh, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about that? It will now take something that had one meaning and blow it up into a bunch of different meanings. And so I think we have to really have a balance when we're dealing with stuff because a lot of this, and don't get me wrong, there is people talk about political correctness. I do think that some people say, oh, we shouldn't be politically correct. Well, no, there's a difference between being politically correct and being polite, right? Because I think we've lost politeness in our country. We've lost kindness in not just our country, but I think even in our world. The ability to have respect and to look at another person and be kind to them. And if they have a different opinion than us, not just put them in a label or a category, but say, okay, you know what, I disagree with your opinion, but why do you believe that? And have a dialogue on even some of the most controversial of topics. We've lost that ability. But I think that this whole thing where, you know, people are just, they're getting to the point where they're being so sensitive about everything, where you cannot have a dialogue or comedians can't even make jokes anymore. Where, being a comedian, at one point, it was an opportunity for you to make a statement, almost like a satirical statement about what's going on in society by calling out what a lot of people are thinking. Because I think this politically correct culture that we're looking at, where everything is, you're scared to get canceled, while in some ways it helps to hold people accountable, you start kind of stripping away people's ability to truly expose themselves. Because now people, what they do is they kind of refrain, or they start shifting into a zone of, okay, well, I'm just going to keep my stuff to myself. And then when you begin to notice this in anonymous boards and on social media where you can not reveal your identity, you see some of the most hateful, some of the most disgusting, some of the most misogynistic, sexist, racist comments that people are making because they feel as if when they can keep their identity to themselves, no one will know. People didn't think that in this election that Donald Trump was going to get a bunch of votes because they're like, surely this man will not get, after all the things he's done in the last 4 years, people are not going to support him. But then you turn around and you see 71 million people voted for this guy, right? Now, not all those people, we can't label every single person that voted for him as a racist, obviously, because there's a whole conglomerate of individuals within that demographic. But why is it that there are some people that voted for him that might have been out there saying, oh, yeah, Joe Biden, Black Lives Matter, all this stuff? It's because people are afraid, because it's gotten to such a point where when you're living in a cancel culture, right, where people are not allowed to talk about their ideas and we confront the ideas and we confront people on their ideas and we hold them accountable, or we have a meeting of the minds and we duke it out in the public square of open debate, people automatically just get labeled. So what do? They retreat to the most private aspects, right? Where you can make your voice heard in society. What's the most ultimate place you can make your voice heard that makes a difference? The ballot box, right? And nobody knows who you voted for if you don't want to tell them. So I think we've gotten to such a point now, people are dealing with anxiety. They're afraid that something that they said 10, 15 years ago is going to get exposed. So they go and delete tweets. They're trying to give a perfect answer. And when each and every one of us is living in society, not progressing, but as perfectionists, anxiety and depression are sure to float to the surface because people are trying to be perfect. They're trying to get the perfect answer. They're trying to say the right things. And what it doesn't lead to is growth, which is core to human beings. Growth is something that, our evolution and growth is something that is normal and natural. I'm not the same height I was when I was a kid, thank God. I don't have the same body that I had when I was a kid, even though I'm in the same body. There's an opportunity for us to grow and to say, you know what, that was a mistake, or I made the wrong choice, or I had the wrong view, because we're exposing ourselves to differences. We're exposing ourselves to shifts and change. And so I think that in a lot of ways, if you look at even some of the stuff in film and everything that's kind of gone on with that, um, look, like I said, I'm all for women in this country. Women in this country and all over the world have been disenfranchised. They've been treated unjustly. They've been told they're less than. That is a lie. It's a disgusting lie. And women should be able to do whatever they put their mind to, whatever they want to do, just like anybody else. because that's their right. They are human beings, right? But what I do have a problem with is this thing that now says, okay, wait a minute, let's pull down males and say that men are disgusting or less than to elevate women. That's the same as saying we should have black supremacy as we're trying to tear down white supremacy. It doesn't lead us to progression in society. And so the thing is this, the masculine balances the feminine balances the masculine. Without, if we only had men in this society, it would be a mess. If we only had women in the society, it would be a mess. We need both. Both are not contradictory, they're complementary, and it helps us to move forward in our world. But until we begin to see that, and until we begin to right some of these wrongs that are in existence, we're going to keep being at odds with each other. And, I get it. I get that, there are people like even in the black community, and just like there are with, women that are trying to move this thing forward because of the injustice that has happened. You see that push. You see that, okay, we need to be more represented in media as black people, or, women need to be more represented in media. I understand that. What we have to do is to say the position of sexism, the position of misogyny, the position of racism was wrong all along because it was created. It was never natural. So as we are elevating, the positions of men, or excuse me, the positions of women in society to be equal as that of men, and we're elevating the positions of people of color to be equal as that of white people. At the same time, we have to say, look, this was always the right standard. So we're not going to, because it can be very tempting to start trying to replace the wrong thing with the wrong thing. And so I just think it's just very, very important to keep that in mind, because of the fact that we're fighting for justice. We're fighting for on all fronts. And we need to do it in such a way that tells future generations, hey, this is the right way to do it. It's about uplifting every single person in society and not downtrodden another for the sake of feeling a sense of belonging.
I agree. I was watching Kevin Hart's documentary a little while ago, and one of the central themes that goes through the whole documentary is him talking about, the trouble that he got into the cancel culture, which
Right.
was because of some tweets he made back in the day. I think the tweet said something like, "The worst thing that could ever happen to him was if his son told him he was gay." But this tweet was from like years ago. So
Right.
when he came under fire for this tweet, and there were a lot of people, I mean, Kevin Hart is arguably one of the biggest comedians on the planet. And, now
Yeah.
there's this big move of, oh, we should
I got
cancel
a
Kevin
personal
Hart.
bias. I love Kevin Hart,
I
so
love Kevin
I'm
Hart
a
too.
I'm a say it's a little bit more than arguably, but it's between him and Dave Chappelle. I love Dave Chappelle. They're just funny people. But
Yeah.
continue.
But yeah, so I mean, he was he came on this documentary, and also he was on a podcast that I listened to, talking about the
Right.
situation. And what he said was so important, where he spoke about how if you if you are going to prosecute someone for something they did or
Right.
said 10 years ago, what you're doing is you are dis disempowering the idea of personal growth. Because what
Right.
that means is that you are prosecuting them today as if they are the same person that they were back then. And you cannot call Kevin Hart a homophobe in 2020 if he made a homophobic tweet in 2014, especially if he comes out and says, listen, I don't stand by this at all anymore. I was a moron. That was a dumb thing to say. And
Right.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, I've always, one of the things I stand by, and I say this often to people that are around me. I say I'm always one good conversation away from changing all my opinions, and that's very true.
Right.
Like you need to be open and flexible. For example, very good example, when the pandemic started in early March was the first case in South Africa. And obviously we were still, I go to the University of Pretoria, so I was still
Mhm.
going to campus. Everyone was still going to campus for a few weeks. And now as the case numbers started to go up in South Africa, the conversations about lockdown started happening. So
Right.
people were talking about, should we go into a hard lockdown? What's the right way to go about this? So I on my meme page, I started chatting with people who were following me, and the opinion that I put out on my meme page at the time was that I was pro herd immunity. I said, The
Hmm.
experts are saying a vaccine is like 3-4 years away. In that time, the economy will be completely destroyed.
Right.
If let's say 10% of the population is going to die, they're either going to die within a year or they're going to die within 3 years. I think it's best to do it within a year. And I got a lot of, like, obviously a lot of people were very upset with me for this opinion, and rightly so. So I had a lot of debates with a lot of people, talking back and forth, people explaining to me their opinions,
Hmm.
people who supported my opinions, basically just hearing a lot of different, ideas, and hearing what people had to say about it. And after about 3 or 4 days of this debate, I changed my opinion. I said, you know what? It was a dumb thing to say. We should
Right.
not we should not risk, the lives of the elderly, because they explained to me things that came into play, like the pressure on hospitals and so on, and how that could contribute to the amount of deaths and so on. So I had an opinion. I
Right.
got new opinions, new information, and then I changed my opinion,
Right.
which I think
Right.
is, it happens to people all the time, even if they might not know it. People change their opinions on a daily basis. So
Absolutely.
I think that
Absolutely.
cancel culture is fundamentally against the idea of people being able to change their opinions, which is a really big problem. And also, I feel like I'm going to mention a few comedians here, but I feel like maybe my opinion's a bit biased, because I feel like comedians have a special niche where they may be a little bit immune from cancel culture. But Joe
Hmm.
Rogan was talking to someone, and the other person said to him, you got to be careful what you say nowadays. And Joe Rogan looked
Right.
at him and said, I don't think you do have to be careful. Yeah, and the other guy asked him, what do you mean? And they had this conversation back and forth where Joe Rogan was saying he thinks that people will only, the only people who get cancelled are people who allow themselves to get cancelled. People who respond to the cancel culture as dramatically as the people who are saying they should be cancelled. So
Right.
now you look at someone like Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais is my favorite comedian. He's probably one of the most offensive people on the planet as well, with his jokes. And he was telling,
Yeah.
like,
That. I remember that. I remember when he hosted. I think it was the Oscars
the Golden Globes.
and or the Golden Globes. Sorry. Yeah. I always get those confused. And he, offended a lot of people. I thought it was funny. Honestly, I could clearly see that he was, in some ways, kind of telling the truth about some things, but in a kind of satirical manner. And then, of course, I kind of also have a bias because he gave us The Office. So I mean, that is one of my favorite shows of all time. But yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, Ricky Gervais, he's doing a bit. I think it was on his Netflix special, which is called Humanity, which I would highly recommend. But he was talking
Mm,
about
okay.
how he was on his way to the Golden Globes in his car with his wife.
Hmm.
And while they were driving, he says something he always does to rile his wife up, is he'll write down jokes that are way worse than the jokes he's actually going to tell, and then he'll tell his wife he's going to tell those jokes. And obviously that would, she freaks out thinking, oh, Ricky, you can't say these things, and so on. But the point that he makes is, he says there's a very specific line, and I find that when I tell people about this line out of context, it doesn't have nearly as much effect. But I'm going to do my best. He says
Right.
that there's a part where he tells a joke to his wife, and she says, "No, Ricky, you can't say that. People will be upset." And
Hmm.
he then looks at her and says, "Relax, Jane. They're not coming to the house." Which is obviously, it's a silly line, but he's right. I mean, the problem is to the extent of putting your phone down. Once you put your phone down, that problem's gone. Now
Right.
obviously there are there are exceptions to this rule. Things like in Hollywood, where people will be fired from their studios, and people's lives get really affected by these sorts of things. But now you
Right.
take the example of James Gunn. James Gunn tweeted some, offensive stuff many years ago when Twitter was just starting. He obviously forgot about it. He moved on. He grew as a person. Then, after he had directed Guardians of the Galaxy 1, I think, and the second one, or just before he was meant to start on the second one, these tweets are discovered. Now James Gunn gets fired from the studio for these tweets. and now the rest of the cast or the rest of the Marvel group sort of rally together and get him hired back. I think that that kind of situation is going to happen more and more and more, where people, cancel culture has become so overbearing and so
Right,
unnecessary in some cases that I think people are going to stop taking it seriously, and it's going to lose
right.
its effectiveness over the course of the next few years. So, on your point where you say you sort of got to be careful about what you say, I think that that is true, but I also think that logic prevails at the end in most cases.
Right. No, and listen, man, I'm gonna tell you, I kind of err more on the side of what Ricky Gervais said. He said, listen, you're not coming to the house. That doesn't mean you just go around just saying disrespectful things and repugnant things, right? Like I don't believe in that. But I do believe that if you are sharing an opinion or a perspective about something, well, here's the deal. It's an opinion. And I think that's the biggest problem. Like a lot of people, I'm reading this book right now called The Coddling of the American Mind. And if you've never read this book, highly recommend it. It basically is talking about like how this growth in like trying to protect people from, from certain trends or schools of thought that might be offensive or make people feel uncomfortable. It's something that's happened on college campuses and in society. And we think that it makes people better, but it actually is making people more ignorant, because what ends up happening is that you can never know the truth without knowing what a lie is, right? You can never know, you would never know the worth of something good without knowing what something bad is, right? Because then everything would just be good. You would have nothing to measure it up against. And so what you look at is that people, they're not able to make statements and flush out certain ideas or beliefs and have the opportunity to have that challenged by another person. And like you said, to the point of personal growth, you can't grow if you're always just thinking everything you're doing is right, because you have to. It's like when you ride a bike, you don't learn how to ride a bike by getting on there and just, okay, cool, I'm on here, I've got this, I've got everything right. You got to learn balance. You got to build up that ability to kind of hold that balance, and you're gonna fall a couple of times. You're gonna say stuff in life that's not right. You're gonna say things in life that's not accurate. We're human beings. We're imperfect. But like I said, cancel culture at just like its greatest form, it denies human beings the most basic thing that comes naturally to us, and that is growth, right? And it's not just like your body growing, but it's also your mind being able to grow. um Imagine if imagine, let's say I was like 300 pounds, right? 300, 400 pounds, and someone looked at me and they only saw me like, they imagined me in my 30s at being at 300 pounds, right? And they literally talked to me like I was going to be 300 pounds my whole life, right? That would not give me much incentive for my own, the sake of my own health, to try to say, okay, well, let me get my health together and try to lose weight or whatever so I can be more healthy. And so what we're beginning to see in society is that ignorance is being accepted, where if people say something, we're just like, oh, well, that's that person's opinion, and we're just going to let them believe that. And then if someone brings out something that doesn't go with the mainstream, we cancel them. And so I do agree with you. I believe it's not sustainable. It might be happening for a little while, but it's not sustainable. You're not going to be able to sustain that movement or that motion, because people are going to say, wait a minute, like I am not the same person that I used to be. And it's so funny because it's almost contradictory. We live in a greatest time where people are pushing for self growth. I see more posts about self development. I see more posts about growth, but yet at the same time, we're canceling people. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, wait a minute. Let's look back at some of your greatest, your your greatest worst hits, if you know what I'm talking about. Would you want somebody to look at you when you were, let's say you are 30, 40 years old, and you got a successful career and you've changed a lot of your thought process, and someone goes and finds a dumb tweet that you tweeted back when you were 25, or somebody, let's say a lot of the people that are around today, because a lot of people that I know today and everything, this generation is growing up on the internet, right? Like they had the internet at their fingertips when they were like 8, 9, 10 years old or whatever. Let's say you post something dumb, right? Because I remember, back when people used to say things like, "Oh, this person's so gay" or whatever, this and that. I went to school with some of these people, right? If these people had someone follow them around with a camera back when they were going to school, when they were easily influenced, when they were just trying to be the cool kid, and they started saying some of these words in today's society, or someone went and played back the reel of their high school or college, they would be canceled, right? But some of these people, they don't espouse those same beliefs as they did before. And so I think that, we have to open up the door to say, okay, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. Society and people were more complicated than that. We have to begin to, tear down these walls of division. Don't get me wrong, hold people accountable, 100%, right? If this is the way you've communicated, you need to be held accountable for that. But if you've changed, if you're a different person, if you're developing into a different person, we've got to say, okay, just like the human body develops, like when you work on the human body, it develops. If you put good food into the body, it develops. If you work on a house that needs renovation, you don't. If you live in a house and the bedroom needs to be renovated, you don't burn or demolish the whole house to start again. You say no. We're going to rip out. We love the living room. We love the kitchen. We love the gaming area. But we're going to go. We're going to tear down the aspect of the bedroom, or renovate the aspect of the bedroom that's faulty. Why? Because of the fact that it still has an opportunity to change. We have an opportunity to look at the wrongs that we've done and correct the wrongs that we've done. If that's how if that's the case, this country should be canceled. The United States of America should not exist at this point. If that's the case, every single white person in the United States should be canceled. Every single white person in the United States of America should not be allowed to have what they have, because of the fact that, your ancestors or your parents or whatever, they had certain beliefs. Your ancestors and parents, they had certain ideologies that they espoused to. So canceling people, just ultimately, it just does not make sense to me. And I think that we've got to get to a point where we become more rational as human beings. We begin to realize that, hey, when you live in a society of perfection, where perfection is the norm, perfection does not give way to compassion. Perfection does not give way towards growth and change. But when we look at ourselves and say, okay, wait a minute, we need to look at the fact that we can make the same mistakes. We can shift for the better. Then we can realize that as other people have changes of heart, so can we have changes of heart.
I agree. In fact, I love your opinion. I couldn't agree with you more on this. I think there needs to be a time limit. There needs to be like a certain period in which cancel culture is allowed. Because if a tweet surfaces from me that's racist or homophobic from 10 years ago, that's in the past. Like everyone, that shouldn't. We should laugh about it. Be like, how ridiculous that was the idea at the time. We should definitely check if that's still the opinion. You should ask the person. You said something homophobic 10 years ago. Do you still agree to that? And if they say no, 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 that's awful, then okay, cool, we forget about it. But if
Yeah,
if
and I think we
someone's
should. I think we should check them and keep an eye on them too, because people out in the public eye today, they get you say racist or you say bigot or anything like that. People are like, oh, no, 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 that's not me. But then privately, you will hear conversations. So I think that's why people kind of get nervous about the denial clause, as I like to call it, because everybody can just claim denial and whatever. But yeah, I agree with you. Like, we're all, depending on where you grew up, depending on the people that you're around, you're gonna say some stupid stuff, and then you might go to school, you might go to college, you might get more educated and be like, "Wow, I'm an idiot. I can't believe that I believed those things." And it's like something you correct yourself, and now you have to go about reforming your whole life. You know?
Yeah, we've had. I was chatting to some of my followers on the meme page a couple of weeks ago. I've mentioned this in another podcast as well, where I was chatting to a different guy. But I mentioned we were chatting about racism, and one of the questions that I
Right.
asked was I asked people who were racist or are racist, why were you
Yeah.
racist, and what changed? And a few people
Yeah.
responded. I mean, I was actually quite shocked. There was one guy. I actually know the guy. I don't, we're not friends, but he's a friend of a friend. I've met him before. Sent me this opinion where he was like very racist. He was like, he does not think the races should mix. He thinks they should be segregated, which I was very shocked by. But the majority of the people were saying the same story. And the story is quite interesting. And it speaks to this as well, where they said they grew up in families that were in isolated communities, single race communities, black and white, isolated communities. They grew up in a racist mindset. They were taught to be racist. They were racist people for their whole childhood. They went to schools that were single race, where, I mean, even their teachers, in some cases, forwarded these racist ideas. Then they go to universities which are out of their home province. I mean, our provinces are like your states. They go out of their home province. They go to a different to a university where suddenly everything is very mixed. There's people of all races represented. And it's very,
Mm.
very difficult to be racist if you can't help but be friends with someone of a different race. If you're sitting
Right.
if you're sitting in a lecture and you're a deeply racist person, and there's so let's say I'm a white guy. If I'm racist and there's a black guy over there and he says something that is really funny, like it's just the funniest thing I've ever heard. I can't. I mean, how could you? How could you try and force yourself to not like that guy just because he's black? It just doesn't work that way. Humans aren't built that way. So the example that I gave when I was chatting on the podcast was that if you're deeply racist and you're in your room at your residence and you think that all black people are bad, but suddenly a black person leans in and asks you if you want to go for a drink, and you end up going for the drink and you have a great time, you now have to reevaluate everything you've ever believed about race. And I think that happens a lot. It's exposure to different ideas, to different situations, that then leads to personal growth. Um,
Right.
so I think it's ridiculous to say that since you held a certain opinion once, you should be cancelled completely and people should never listen to anything you have to say again. I think that's entirely stupid. So yeah, in personal growth is something that I really believe in,
Yeah.
and something that a lot about me, a lot of my opinions have changed over the years. So I personally would be, I'd be very upset if I were if
Right.
I were disenfranchised due to something I believed 5 or 10 years ago. But
Right, man. And you're. I'll say this to that point, and I know we're starting to wind down to close, but I'll just tell you, man. I think your background is your battleground, as I always like to say. If you if you have a background, right? um, or you have certain beliefs because of maybe the way you grew up. Let's say you didn't really look into certain topics, or maybe you didn't grow up with a bunch of uh, maybe friends that were of different cultures or whatever, or you were largely isolated from those people. Whatever you heard pretty much in your house as a kid, or whatever you grew up kind of around, that shapes the narrative that you take on. And so your background then becomes the battleground that you stand on certain issues. And this is not just the way you look at people of different races or cultures, but it could even shape your religious beliefs. It could shape your beliefs about the economy, your beliefs about health, your beliefs about everything. And so I think that what people don't understand is that we all have a bias. Everybody likes to be out here pretending like they don't have a bias and they're trying to be less biased. For the rest of your life, you will always have a bias. There is no individual out there that is not biased, right? Because there are preferences that you have based off of things that make the most sense to you. And there are things that are going to make a lot of sense to you that don't make a lot of sense to other people, which is why it's a bias. And so I think that when we understand that if we're constantly changing the background, right? If we're constantly shifting our backgrounds based off of our exposure to ideas and people and ideas that are different than ours, um, and I think we should encourage in society more exposure to different ideas and talking about different ideas instead of just saying we're just going to force a set of ideas on people and say this is the way. No, we need to have more honest dialogue about. We need to have more honest dialogue and have people that have racist ideas and have people that have certain ideas come out and say, this is what my thoughts are, and we can confront those people, because then at least you've flushed it out and you've confronted the people in a conversation, and now what can happen is they've been exposed, right? And now they have an opportunity to either change or continue to walk in that direction once they've been confronted with truth, right? But I believe now, because we've had such a thing that happens where we're not necessarily allowing that, people's background doesn't change. They become more entrenched in their background because they're already seen as a deplorable individual in society. And so they now become entrenched in the community that background provides, which leads to more hate. And so I believe that, when you have groups of people now where we're constantly going back and we're shifting the paradigm, and like you said, you might have that racist idea, But then you go and connect with someone that's a person of color, and now all of a sudden you have the best experience of your life. I remember watching the movie Green Book, and then I'll end this statement with this. I watched the movie Green Book, which is one of the best movies I have ever seen in my entire life. And if people haven't seen Green Book, they should go watch it. Shameless plug, even though I have nothing to do with the film. Um, in that movie, one thing that I saw was the guy started off, he was very racist, right? He had certain ideas. The guy, I believe there was one thing where the guy that was black was at their house, and I think he either took the dish and threw out the dish the guy either eaten or drank out of. I can't exactly remember what it was. But when you saw the guy at the beginning of the film, first of all, the greatest irony of it is that historically Italians were discriminated against in the United States as well. And so you look at a person that has been discriminated against, and yet they're still discriminating against another person because it's like, well, I'm Italian, but I'm not black. And you see these two people in a situation where they're together, and he goes and he sees this black man who has a lot of money and a lot of wealth and a lot of status, and he has to work for the black guy. And so that challenges his first perspective about black people and the thoughts that he had about black people. But then moving forward, as he continues to drive with this guy and talk with this guy and experience life with this guy, it ends up changing his whole perspective. And literally until the day that the guy died, that was the musician, they were literally friends. And it just shows you like how people, no matter what their background is or their ignorances are, the more exposure that we have to other people, we begin to take down in our heads, if we would allow ourselves the opportunity to be exposed, we can begin to take down these false ideologies. We can go back and change our backgrounds to have new battlegrounds. So now we'll stand up for the rights of people that once we maybe thought weren't as big of a deal, or because it didn't affect us, we didn't immerse ourselves in their world to have empathy for them. You know, so I think really, man, a lot of this has to do with background. And the more we can shape the background that we have and kind of, you know, renovate it, I think we'll take up new battlegrounds for things that actually matter.
I agree. Joseph, I gotta tell you, I've had such an awesome time. I mean, we are out of time now, but I've had such an amazing time chatting to you. You've got such awesome opinions. Thanks so much
Thank you, bro.
for doing
Appreciate it.
this. Yeah, no, I really do appreciate it. So, just before we go, let the people know.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you, I'm not sure if you're gonna plug this on your social media, but I'm sure if you do, I'm gonna have a couple followers from overseas listening.
Yeah.
So, do tell people from all over the world where they can find you.
Yeah, so on social media, people want to follow me. I would appreciate the love. Thank you very much. It's at Haynes Joe one. That's HAYNESJOE number one. And I post things on there. I do have TikTok as well. It's at Cuppa Jojo. That's CUPPAJOJO. I think it's Cuppa Jojo one. Or just Cuppa, I think it's Cuppa Jojo one. I gotta go back and check my own socials. It's funny, but yeah, I'm on there. I like to make more like funny things on TikTok and on Instagram. I just do everything on Instagram. Um, but yeah, that's where people can find me.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
No problem. We got through without talking about the Jubilee video.
I can't believe.